Let's talk about the cube, let's talk about God, let's talk. When the concept of the cube was first introduced, I was intrigued. I really was. The whole scene with Minako being unable to cut through the darkness by shining her light into this menacing void was really cool. And that cool stuff happened because these guys touched the cube, so the cube started off well. But as more chapters have come out, the actual purpose and use of the cube has made less and less sense. And at this point, I have little faith that Murata, or One, had any clue as to what they'd use it for in the future, and how they'd effectively incorporate it within the established monsterization process. To help explain exactly why the cube makes absolutely no sense, let's look at the relationship between God and the cube, and how it has developed throughout chapters. The first time God's influence is mentioned is by Homeless Emperor back in chapter 106. Now it's uncertain if he came into contact with the cube, but he is standing on a box or a carton here, which is cube-like, to be fair. But he never, at any point, mentions anything about an odd magical or mysterious object. All the info that Homeless Emperor provides lines up with the explanation that we are given of how monsterization occurs, which is provided to us by Genis in chapter 88. So while it's still not clear as to why Homeless Emperor saw God appear before him, it does make sense that this God would grant him power. But once again, he sees God, no cube is mentioned. Keep this in mind moving forward. Next time is with Psychos, who sees God when she's being absorbed by Orochi. She tells Tatsumaki in chapter 132, "I was chosen by a superior entity and was bestowed more power than you possess." Time was stopped. It looked into me. Something like God. Once again, no cube needed for God to appear, and I'm okay with that, because it highlighted the higher power's influence over the monsterization process as a whole, under different circumstances than Homeless Emperors. Psychos was combining with Orochi, and considering how Orochi is the king of monsters, I don't feel like it would be that large of a leap to assume that he'd be more connected to God than other monsters. Next is with Saitama, who finds a cube in chapter 138 when digging Flashy out of some rubble. And this is the first time we ever hear of these cubes. In chapter 139, Blast says, "This cube is somewhat of a communication device. If you come into contact with it, a rift will open in the fabric of space, letting you communicate with him." And this lines up with what had just happened a few moments before, considering Saitama, Flashy, and Minako all touched the cube and then heard God's voice. But here's the thing. After touching the cube, God tells them to place their hand on the cube again and make a fervent wish. So it seems like making a wish isn't enough alone. Direct contact with the cube at the time of the wish was necessary for God to be able to grant the wish. And along with that, unlike with Homeless Emperor and Psychos, God does not appear before them. They only hear him. And after this point, God seems to completely bypass the cube and just contact people when he feels like it. God's next appearance is when he takes Homeless Emperor's powers in life in chapter 153. Now I like this scene, by the way. It was intense and definitely made God out to be more intimidating of a presence than before. Like he's this ever-watching being, pulling the strings in a different place. I thought it was very cool. But was there a cube involved in this interaction? No. At this point, Blast had already confiscated the cube Saitama found. There is no cube to be seen when this happens. God can just climb out from the dark side of the moon and do this shit, no big deal. And once again, I'm totally cool with that. I thought it was fucking cool. Next is Tatsumaki in chapter 156, who's laying on the ground, barely conscious, and God reaches out to her in the form of Blast. And after that is Garou in chapter 164. He gets punched out of his monster form midair and is visited by God. So I actually really like this interaction because it once again highlighted God's connection with strong negative emotion and desperation, reinforcing his influence in the monsterization process. It makes sense that one of the most powerful and emotionally driven characters in the manga would be of particular interest to God. And the same goes for Tatsumaki. She's super powerful and pretty emotionally charged, in a different way than Garou, but charged nonetheless. These two moments are made more significant since God is directly reaching out to both Garou and Tatsu, unlike Psychos or Homeless Emperor. It's important to note that in both these instances, there is no cube present, again, and yet somehow, we see a stronger connection to God than we see after the cube was touched by Saitama and company. In both these instances, God appears before them and physically reaches out, and takes a form resembling someone significant to the individual. Whereas with the cube, God merely speaks to them. So why was this? My theory is that it has to do with Platinum Sperm's defeat. Garou launches himself through Platinum Sperm explodes into sparkly powder or vapor or something, I don't know, it's like, you know, sparkles. But anyways, both Tatsumaki and Garou are both showered in this stuff. And so right after Tatsumaki gets covered in sperm, she's met by God. Along with that, both of them are at their limit. They're unable to fight further. So the combination of this sperm, along with their desperation, allowed God to contact them. Knowing how reluctant Tatsumaki is about relying on others to save her, and Garou's refusal to give up on his goal, this would be the perfect time for God to try to convert them. I am totally cool with both of these moments, because both characters meet the criteria needed to monsterize, without a cube needing to be involved. Which brings me to my next point. Does this story need the cubes at all? So at this point, a cube has monsterized 0 characters that we know of, outside of maybe Empty Void, which may be implied, but it isn't even 100% confirmed, so whatever. Along with that, in these new chapters we also learn that the cube's just been killing people, which strikes me as sorta odd. Because if God is what's causing monsterization, if he is the reason that all these monsters exist, then why is he forfeiting vessels? Why not just make them lesser monsters? And what made Homeless Emperor so special compared to this pile of dead ninjas? And if the goal is to create powerful monsters, why would he turn them into dust when we see so many lesser monsters who are definitely way weaker than the worst of the ninja? So if God can contact 4 characters we know of without a cube and not kill them, and the cube seems to cause more people than less to forfeit their lives instead of turning into monsters, then what is the point of using the cube instead of undergoing monsterization through a different method? My assumption would be that the cube would be able to give someone power beyond what the other modes of monsterization can offer. But how much stronger can a monster get? Cosmic Garou was created with no cube, and Garou didn't even grab God's hand. And based on the fact that Sonic is able to slice Empty Void's arm, I'm going to assume that Empty Void is weaker than Cosmic Fear Garou, because let's be real, there's no chance that Sonic is touching Cosmic Fear Garou. So if Empty Void did use a cube, then he's weak as shit compared to a guy who used no cube at all. Also, it doesn't make sense that Flashy would be released from the cube's illusions because Sonic sliced Empty Void's arm. Why would Sonic slicing Empty Void directly impact the cube's ability to influence Flashy? The only explanation I can come up with is that Murata is implying that Empty Void is projecting his Genjutsu through the cube. So when Sonic slices his arm, he loses concentration and the Genjutsu dissipates. But once again, why? Why would the cube require the help of Empty Void to put Flashy in this dream state when we've seen God reach out to 2 people in that same dream state without a cube and without Empty Void? If touching the cube was supposed to connect you to God, it seems like it can't even do that well anymore, because it requires Empty Void to work. What exactly is causing what to happen and why? What is the point of this fucking cube? Oh yeah, and we also see Blast being visited by God in chapter 173, but he touches a lot of cubes, so whatever. It could potentially be implied that at this point in time, Elder Centipede was able to push Blast to his limit, which allowed God to reach him. I don't know. But regardless, my theory is that the cube blows. The cube sucks. It was never needed, and I think the parameters for monsterization had already been established very effectively beforehand. I like the original cube reveal. This panel's fucking awesome. And because of this panel, I like to imagine that God is a sort of receptor for negative emotion, and that he's been tormented by the collective consciousness of life on Earth. But God and what he represents doesn't need a cube to be cool. So since it's not actually being used to expand on monsterization, I think the cube's true purpose will eventually be to summon God. My theory is that someone will take the cubes and combine them to make a super cube, and then God emerges from the larger cube. Cause look at how he's sitting in this panel. It sort of gives me this impression that he's trapped within something similar to like a box or a cube. But these cubes feel like they're being forced into the plot to add mystery and gravity to moments, when I really don't think they needed to be there at all. You take out the cubes and God's still cool. And honestly, I think taking out the cubes would make God even more cool. Therefore, the cube blows, and I'm Medium Beetle. Thanks for watching.